Good day to you, and here it is, your book for the class. What kind of an impact is this book going to have on your life? Is it the same impact a song that you're hearing on the radio over and over right now will have? How about the same impact a Netflix film that you're going to watch shortly will have? It's tough to say, but surely the book has advantages that other media don't have because of its permanence, its detail, and its accessibility. Yes, it's accessibility, even in an age where we can look at things on our cell phones, because you can open up that book and flip to the page that you want much easier than it is to get through other media. Isn't that the case? Well, that's what we're talking about in Chapter 4, as we now are finally starting to discuss the individual media that comprise our mass media system. We're talking about books today, and we're going to start with the origins of writing, because before you can have books, you have to have writing, and writing begins a long time ago. It begins in Egypt, we think. Somewhere around 3500 BC, we didn't have an alphabet before this time period. We didn't have anything to write with before this time period. What we had were pictographs. These were symbols that people would write on cave walls to try and indicate the upcoming harvest that was needed to be paid attention to for the crops that were outside of the cave. You can see some pictures of that in your book. Very interesting. That's how we first used written forms of communication, as pictographs. And then along comes phonography. Phonography is not like a phonograph that we'll be studying when we talk about audio media. Phonography is using a symbol to indicate a sound. In our language today, we use the symbol C. Maybe it should be this way. C can indicate either a K sound or a S sound. It's a kind of phonography. Kind of phonograph. We also had, during this time period in ancient Egypt and succeeding years, we had finally the invention of the alphabet. And those are letters that can be strung together to produce a phonetic word, but also a word that you can use to write in a book. And we'll be talking about how books made advantage of that later. But still, just because we have a written form of communication doesn't mean we have a medium to write it on to preserve it. And that took some time for development as well. So the original thing, or the original medium that writing was written on, was papyrus. Papyrus was made from a reed of a plant, kind of like bamboo. Basically, you smash it into a pulp, then drain all the water from it, and what you're left with is a kind of sheet of, I won't call it paper, but it's a sheet of something that you can write on. But it's very flimsy and it would fall apart, and that's why we don't have many written records today from ancient Egypt. After that, though, we had the invention of parchment. Parchment comes along around 3100 BC, and now we're using goat skin and other animal skin forms to write onto, using ink and other kind of indelible markers as a way of writing and preserving that writing. Again, is not going to last very long. Not like this book will be lasting. This book will last decades, because finally paper was invented by the Chinese, in fact. Paper was invented from the barks of trees. And it's the idea from papyrus. It's taking all that pulp that comes from trees, mashing it down, extracting the water from it, rolling out the paper until you have thin sheets, and that's where we get paper from. So now everything is in place to write books, and books were being written originally in a facility called a scriptoria. A scriptoria was a place where monks would write books, and it would take 5 years to write a book. Can you imagine that? If you have a book and you want somebody else to have a copy of the book, you have to give it to the monks, and it takes them 5 years to write the book out by hand before they can send it on to the person who's going to receive the book. So production of books, you can imagine, was painfully slow. Also at this time, we didn't have the kind of literacy that we have now, allowing people to read. So books were targeted to a very, very, very tiny population. And you'll find that that's the case with any new media form. It takes a while before it disperses among the entire audience. Even with something like an iPhone or a smartphone, it took a while before grandparents and young kids were starting to use them. And that was the case with books as well. Well, what changed all of that was the Gutenberg printing press. The Gutenberg printing press was an invention from a German metal maker in the 1800s. And he came up with something that was called a type mold. The type mold allowed a printing press to reproduce letters many, many times. So you could produce the letter C many, many times, and eventually you could use the printing press to produce a word many, many times. And so that allowed you, the old printing press was a hand press to pull down and stamp out pages that could go into books and to go into newspapers. It was probably the single most important invention contributing to mass communication because, in essence, that printing press and the books that came forward created the whole idea of mass culture. Mass culture, the idea that now you have hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of people looking at the same form of communication. While you are reading this book for this class, there are thousands of students across the United States reading the same book. You are all part of a mass culture of college students getting similar information from Mr. Hansen, the author. Just think about how profound that is. The t-shirt that I'm wearing today, thousands of other people have. In a way, mass culture has forced the loss of individual identity. If I was living in the 1700s, I'd be wearing a shirt that somebody made for me by hand. I would be reading a book that perhaps was one of a few kinds of books as opposed to a mass production book. So we cannot underestimate what the printing press did and what Mr. Gutenberg's contribution to our mass culture is. Also along the way, by the way, I want to make mention that the printing press helped develop some standardization to our written language. I mean, the whole idea that an exclamation point comes at the end of a sentence in English, well, that had to be arrived at through a common understanding of how do you express drama inside of a sentence. The Spanish put the exclamation point at the beginning of the sentence, but the English speakers put it at the end. So it's a kind of standardization that took place among English speakers, and the printing press made that happen. Now, the printing press, one of its very first profound effects on human life and society is it weakened the stronghold of the Roman Catholic Church on ideas associated with religion. Prior to books, if you believed in a god, you had to go to the priest, who was said to have direct access to the god. You couldn't go to the god yourself because you couldn't understand what the god was saying. You couldn't understand the writings. You couldn't understand the beliefs, the values. That was the priest's job to communicate those values. And any communication with the deity had to be done through the priest. Well, the Gutenberg printing press changed all that because it made the Bible, it made it possible to disseminate it to hundreds, thousands, and millions of people. So now people are able to read, and they're able to educate themselves on religion, and now they have access to religious ideas. The priest is not needed as much, and that's why you have the Protestant Reformation. It's taking away the seminal role of the priest in disseminating religious knowledge and saying that it can be it can be dispersed more evenly among lower members of the clergy, if I can say things that way. Now let's turn our attention to how books developed in the New World. That's our world, as we may not consider it anymore, but it was known as the New World when North America was discovered. And the very first book that we have can be traced back to 1640 in New England, and the book was called The Whole, W-H-O-L-E, The Whole Book of Psalms. It was a religious text, P-S-A-L-M-E-S, Psalms. It was a religious text in 1640. It was developed for the Puritans to be able to practice their religion from. Another major development in books in the New World comes from a very famous inventor that has a lot of time here in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. I'm talking about Ben Franklin. We know him for his many inventions and his role in the Constitution, but we don't know so much about the fact that he established the very first, we believe, public library, a place where people could go and get books. Just like I have a library behind me, it's a private library, but Ben Franklin established the first public library in Philadelphia. And in the old days, Ben Franklin's time, libraries were not what we think of now, where you go in and you can go on the computer and you can sign books and DVDs out for free. No, you had to pay a yearly subscription to a library, just like we do to newspapers today in some cases. That was Mr. Ben Franklin. All right, now we return to an idea I introduced in an earlier class, and that's the industrial age. The industrial age, once again, is the factorization of the United States. It's all these factories growing up because of technology, of equipment that allows things like this calculator, this pen, anything that you see around to be produced in mass. It doesn't have to be produced by hand anymore. It can be produced, it's produced by mass. So people moved to the cities where the factories were located, and they started to earn jobs, they started to earn wealth, and also people started to be educated in public schools. There was a need to educate people in public schools rather than the local church or the local farmhouse back in your rural community. All of this gave a massive infusion for a need for books. Think about it. You have all these people in school, you need to have books. So the need for books is being fueled by industrialization. Also, it's possible to produce books industrially. You can read about some more inventions in the chapter, but we come from Gutenberg's printing press to a steam press. It doesn't have to be produced by hand. It can be produced by creating hot water to allow machinery to move based on the steam that's created. And then later on, electricity is going to be the energy source for those printing presses. And now we can print out lots and lots and lots of books in a very short period of time, as opposed to even the printing press, which would take a couple days to print out a book. So now we're going to turn to various dimensions of the book industry, we should say. And the first dimension we want to talk about is publishers. Publishers of books are just like the consolidated companies that we talked about in the last class. They own lots of individual, what they call imprints. An imprint is an individual publisher that might specialize in romance novels, for example. And another imprint might specialize in science fiction. And another imprint might specialize in young adult fiction. So a giant publisher like Random House or Pearson will have several different imprints. In fact, I have a college textbook that's called Comparing Media from Around the World. I use it in my comparative media class. That's part of the imprint called Allen and Bacon, which is part of a larger publisher called the Pearson Company, which is the largest publisher in educational publishing in the world. Most of the books that you've read in college are coming in some way, shape, or form from the Pearson Company. Also, we have university presses and small press publishers. Penn State University has a university press. They publish mostly scholarly books and scholarly journals. It's a big factor within the university world, but compared to the consolidated big players like Random House, not so big. And then we have lots of smaller players too, like the Bear Creek Media Group. Or we have Allen and Bacon Allen and Bacon is part of the bigger publishing empire, but there's a whole slew of small publishers out there that are publishing books and trying to create wealth just with having a successful novel or a successful sci-fi or a successful biography that people are buying in enough mass to create wealth within that company, but it doesn't compare anywhere near to the huge conglomerates. Next up is the idea that the government printing office is a big player in the book industry as well. The government printing office produces all the manuals that are provided by government. Those manuals are online, but there's lots of written manuals as well, like the Code of Federal Regulations. And one of the biggest successes of it was the report on the John F. Kennedy assassination. That was had the biggest runs, as they say in the publishing industry. And then there are booksellers, places where you can get books. And within booksellers, there are wholesalers like the Ingram Company, I-N-G-R-A-M, the biggest wholesaler in the United States. How does a book get into a Barnes & Noble? How does a book get into an airport bookshop? How does a book get into any retailer that you find on the street? It has to be distributed by a wholesaler like Ingram, who takes the books from the publisher and then gets them onto the shelves into a store. And so that's the Ingram Company. And then we have lots of retailers today. We have much less than we used to, but Barnes & Noble is by far the biggest. It's even in college campuses, as you well know, here at ESU. If you're going to buy a college textbook at the bookstore, it's going to be bought from Barnes & Noble. Of course, Barnes & Noble has a big online presence as well. This brings up the textbook business. Not a very happy subject for most students because of the cost of textbooks. I'm buying textbooks for my daughter. It's going to be $400 to $500 next semester. I know how bad it is. And that's why students have turned to lots of other different methods like renting books, borrowing books. Some of you may be trying to get away with an older edition of this book for class because it was cheaper for you. That's at your own risk. I understand, though, why you're needing to do that because of the cost of textbooks, but it's a big business. Now we turn our attention to a larger question, that is books and culture. And what can we say about books and the impact that they have on our culture? Well, one impact is the idea of literary books versus blockbusters. Blockbusters are those books that you go into a bookstore and you see it's on the New York Times bestseller list. The J.K. Rowling books, all the Harry Potter books, they were blockbuster books. And they sold millions of copies that allowed her to write sequels and develop films and develop stage plays. Those are blockbuster books. Very successful. Many people read them. Same with the Hunger Games. But then there are also literary books, books that have lasting value, like Catcher in the Rye, like any Hemingway book, like any Shakespeare book. These are books that are not going to have mass appeal. You're not going to find hundreds and hundreds and thousands and millions of people buying them, but they are important because of the values that they instill, because of the analyses that they offer, because of the timeless issues that they speak to, which matter no matter what your generation is. And there's always a tension there because books, as we noted in an earlier class, are part of a private profit-making business. The interest mostly on the part of booksellers, book writers, and really any dimension of the book publishing industry is to try to sell as many as possible. That's not always necessarily best for our society. Now we turn our attention to the long tail. The long tail is pretty much the model for book publishing today. It's been created by the Amazon company. The Amazon company has allowed anybody to become an author, like myself. Hold on a sec. Here's my book, Rounding Some Corners, which you'll be reading a little bit later in the class, and I'll explain why I've assigned that book in this class. I self-published that book on Amazon. Every time I look at it, it's got about a sale of 1 or 2 books per month, and the royalties are not that big on it. It's only about 70 cents per book. I'm not looking to make money off of that book, especially in the context of this class, but what I'm trying to point out is this is not the short head model for media distribution. In the short head model, you're trying to sell high volume at a quick pace. Instead, what Amazon has done is it's allowed every single person, including you in this audience, to write a book and to publish it. But it's going to take a long time for it to eke out sales, 1 or 2 a month, because it's hard for people to find that on Amazon. That's the way most books have become, and in fact, that's what's made it very difficult for authors like myself trying to find a major publisher for this book. Authors must get an agent today. The agent then pitches the book to a major publisher, and that's the stage I'm at after a year and a half of sending out queries. These are pitches to agents for why my book is important or is going to be a commercial success, etc. After a year and a half, I finally got an agent in New Jersey, and right now he's sending out proposals of my book to major publishers, and maybe there will be some news by the end of this class. I don't think so, but maybe there will. I just want to give you an inside insight into what it's like for authors today to try and strike it big by getting their book accepted by a publisher, and that's because books today are not selling like they used to. The average American household only buys 1 new book a year. So publishers want to be very careful about what they publish, and if they publish a book, they want it to be by an author who has a huge platform, that is a fan base, that is people that the author will automatically be in touch with who will want to buy that author's book through the author's social media, through their guest speaking engagements, through their reputation, through their website. That's the way that the book industry has become. And part of the reason for that is our final point, which is about electronic book publishing. It's said to be the wave of the future, but who really knows, because there is a lot of inconvenience in trying to read a book on a Kindle or some other device, even your smartphone or laptop. It's not as easy to go right to the page that you want to. I can go right here to page 108 if I want to. It's kind of tough to do on a tablet. Also, you've got the whole battery charging issue. And you've got the whole idea of carrying an electronic around, which is somewhat sensitive and you have to be careful with. You may not want to take it down the beach like you would a book. Even if you get sand in a book, it doesn't really matter to you that much. You can still read it. So this is changing the industry, but we're not sure how much. One area that we do know that has been successful is audiobooks. Because Americans spend so much time in their vehicles, audiobooks are a way for them to pass that boredom, listening to books on CD, on DVD, on satellite while they're driving. So there you have it, our very first mass communication technology, the book. And soon we'll be moving on to others. Have a great day.